Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this week's video, we're going to talk about handheld and weapon-mounted light techniques for everyday carry. Now, if you've been on the internet for more than 10 minutes, you know there's always going to be a debate about handheld light or weapon-mounted light. Which one should you have? My answer is pretty simple. You should have both. You should carry both religiously. Consider it part of that little hashtag EDC, everyday carry gear. Every day means every day. Reasoning behind that is a weapon-mounted light is only going to be used if I have a reasonable expectation of using the firearm, or if I'm pulling the firearm in a defensive posture. Whereas a handheld light, now I know I've talked about this before in videos past, but I wanted to do another one. A handheld light is much more versatile and much more useful in your everyday life than a weapon-mounted light. Now, it's something I talk about in classes, is the handheld light. I can have the handheld light in my hand at pretty much any time. If it's light outside, I'm going into a dimly lit building or dimly lit parking garage or something of that nature, I can have the light in my hand. If a light society is willing to accept the fact that somebody can carry around a flashlight, that's not really so strange. Whereas if I'm going into a parking garage or a very dimly lit environment and I have no reasonable expectation of needing to use force, drawing my firearm and using my weapon-mounted light is kind of silly. And I think everybody would agree, like, no one would do that. There's probably a small minority of people who might, but the point is, this is going to be much more versatile than a weapon-mounted light, and reasons that I can use it in quote-unquote administrative tasks, but I can also use it as a deterrent against a potential use of force. In my career, I've pointed guns at people much more often than I've actually used them, but I've pointed handheld lights at people much more often than I've pointed guns at people. And just the use of a handheld light, like we're going to talk about in this video, as a deterrent and as a data gatherer, can help you prevent the need to actually escalate a situation into a use of force.
Hey, what are you doing in here? I work here. Dude, there's no way you work here. I work here. Who are you? I work here. You do not work here.
All right, before we get into technique, let's talk a little bit about gear. How many lumens should your handheld light have? The short answer is as many as possible. Surefire makes 1,000 lumen models. There's other companies out there that make 960, 900, 1,000, as many as you can possibly carry. Now, this model, the P3X Fury, is a larger, it's a 3-battery model, so it's a little more cumbersome, I would say, to carry in your back pocket. The Fury, obviously a little bit smaller, 500 max lumens, and then you've got other models as well. You've got other brands such as 4.7s. My personal feeling is I'm very Surefire-centric because they make a very durable light. It's got an amazing warranty, and it's got a really good beam on it. Now, some people say, well, you know, if you're going to be using your light indoors, you shouldn't have that many lumens. You shouldn't have max lumens. And I disagree with that based on technique and training, but think about a daytime situation. If I'm out in sunlight, I have all the lumens, so to speak. If I'm in darkness, either artificial created by a structure or a power outage or something like that, or if it's nighttime, the light available to me is the light that I bring to the game, bring to the situation. So I've never heard someone say, and this is kind of paraphrasing from another instructor, I didn't have enough, I wish I didn't have as much light as I did. 1,000 lumens is going to give you the ability to collect a lot of data versus using a light that only produces 170 or 220. Now, you don't need to get wrapped around the axle, but think about the situation. How much data do you want to collect? How fast do you want to collect it? The brighter the light, the better the possibility. Now, people talk a lot about backsplash. Like, if the light's too bright, you could shine it off an object and temporarily blind yourself. Well, one of the things we're going to talk about in this video is techniques to avoid doing that, so you can have a light that allows the maximum amount of lumens that you're able to physically carry. Weapon-mounted lights. Surefire is pretty much the standard. The X300U, that's my everyday carry light. You've got the X300V, which is 150 lumens night vision capable. Again, that's for a very specific market. You've got light companies out there like Veridian. They make a decent light. You've got options. But again, just like with the handheld, with the weapon-mounted light, especially if you're going to be using a weapon-mounted light, I think the reasonable expectation is if you're using your weapon-mounted light, you have a reasonable expectation of using your weapon. So would you not also want the most lumens possible? If I'm maybe going to use my weapon in self-defense, I want to be able to collect as much data as I can before I press that trigger. So when I shoot, if I shoot, I know without a shadow of a doubt that what I'm looking at deserves to have gunfire pointed at it. So getting right into technique with the handheld light. When should I have a handheld light out? Anytime you need to gather more data. If it's dark or you're in a dark area, you're in a dark building, a dark room, something like that, and you need to gather visual data. You need to see in a corner, through a doorway, around the pillar of a parking garage, in an alley, whatever. You have the light already in your hand because you're in an environment where you're not getting as much light, you're not able to see as much data. And you just give it a little burst of light, that's it. Now you've gathered data for that area and you can move on with your life. The flashlight's in your hand. I carry mine in my support side rear pocket. Comes out anytime it's dark, I have it in my hand, and even from a quote-unquote administrative point of view, now I'm able to gather data and see things sooner than I would if I had to get closer to them in a low-light situation to really kind of figure out what it is I'm looking at. And I already talked about it, polite society, see a guy with a flashlight in his hand and probably think nothing of it. From the criminal side point of view, if you think about criminals, and I've, something when I was still full-time law enforcement, any chance I got, I'd ask criminals about this. What does a guy with a flashlight in his hand say to you? And the answer that I got, not all the time, not every time, I wouldn't even say 50% of the time, but the answer that I would hear, one that was definitely a common denominator, was, oh, that's a cop. That could be a cop. So if you think about it from a deterrent point of view, without even using it in a self-defense feature, a self-defense technique, or self-defense posture, I've already created a deterrent by the fact that I'm readily available to see into the darkness. All right, so handheld technique. What's beneficial in having a light ready in your hand versus having it in your pocket or only relying on a weapon-mounted light? Let's take a look at it. So using your handheld light in a low-light situation. You're outdoors, you're jogging, you're in the park, you're in a parking garage, you're in a low-lit building, there's a power outage, it's just night and you're out on the sidewalk, whatever the situation is. Having the light ready and in your hand allows you, which I already talked about, giving you access to instant visual data. But it also provides you with a deterrent and the ability to kind of control the situation if you encounter an unknown individual on the street. Now, it could be someone who surprises you, startles you, comes around the corner, or you see them approaching from a distance, and as you get closer to that person, something doesn't feel right. Something's wrong with the situation, they're out of place. You're gathering all these subconscious facts about why this person could be a potential threat. So if I'm walking down the street and I encounter an unknown individual, I can initially blast to the face to remove their visual horizon, and then I'm immediately going to bring the light down to their chest to get it out of their eyes. And go, oh man, I'm sorry, can I help you with something?
No.
At this point, I've removed his visual horizon and his night vision, but I've also apologized for doing it to kind of de-escalate a potential situation. I don't want to create a situation. And at this point, I can gather all my visual data off of him, maintaining light control. If I get a bad feeling about him, if he does anything, some kind of sudden movement, like he's reaching in his pocket, I can go back to his face and again remove his visual horizon. Now, obviously, you're not going to encounter this situation very often, but being trained and prepared for it will allow you to gather all the information you need to get while removing all the information he can gather because I have the light in his eyes. Right now, he's got 1,000 lumens in his face. If he closes his eyes, it's the functional equivalent of maintaining light control because he can't get data, he can't get data. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and draw my firearm. Can you see me drawing my firearm?
I can't see anything.
So if I'm worried about potential threat and I feel like it's going to escalate, I can bring my gun out, he hasn't seen it. Now, I'm going to move. Let's see if he can tell you which way I move.
I can't see anything.
All right, now I'm going to move a different direction. Where am I?
I don't know.
Now this is proper light control, maintaining the hot spot of my beam in his face until I've decided, okay, he's not a threat. If it's just a guy like, hey, sorry, my bad, I'm looking for my dog, I can go back to the chest, I'm like, all right, man, take it easy. Now, something people get wrapped around the axle about is using light. They feel like light gives away their position. They feel like people are going to shoot at the light in a use of force situation, especially using a handheld. That's why we have a lot of different techniques for using the light, which we'll get into. But the biggest thing that I think people aren't understanding is right now I'm in a lit room. You can see me. No matter what, I can't conceal myself with darkness. I'm visible. Now, if I were to turn the lights off, the only time you can see me is when I use a light. So what would you say is more advantageous? A lit room or a dark room? Or darkness in general. If I'm using a light, it means I need the light. It means I'm in a situation where there's not enough ambient light for me to gather data. So now I'm using a handheld light. When I'm using a handheld light, the only time you see me or the only time you see where my position is or where I want or where I am is if I allow you to. If I'm treating the camera as a potential threat and I dominate with light, all you see is the light. So there's no really need to get wrapped around the axle about, oh, well, the light's going to give away your position. It is, but you decide when that happens. Now, handheld light techniques when the gun comes out. There's a lot of them out there. Majority of them all do the same thing. If you think about what's known as the FBI technique, I'm shooting one-handed. If you think about coming into this particular grip, the Harry's, am I shooting one-handed? Technically, yes, I am. The only thing this hand is going to do, even when properly mated and properly done, is it's going to help mitigate recoil as the gun comes back down. That's it. That's the only support I'm really giving the gun, other than a little added stability for aiming it. But it's not a two-handed grip. There are very, very few two-handed grips that you can use with the aid of a flashlight without a device like a therm or a finger groove or a finger loop or a hook or something like that. So another thing not to get wrapped around the axle about is two-handed shooting techniques with the handheld light, unless you're going to use one of those devices, which if you want to throw one on your light, I highly recommend it. How many grips should you have? You should have two. You should have two grips, one that's going to work on either side of the gun. And I'm going to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So this is my cover or my concealment. I'm primarily a left-handed shooter. If I have a left side exposure around my cover or concealment, I want to use a grip that allows the light to be on the outside of the firearm. That prevents me from having to lean out as far to use the light. It also prevents the light from backsplashing off the cover and illuminating it. Now, if I move over to the right side cover as a left-handed shooter, this grip wouldn't make as much sense because I'm going to have to lean out further to get the light into the fight. So I would use modified FBI, come out like that. Whatever the situation may be, I'm going to use a technique that puts the light on the right side of the firearm. So now from behind cover, using the proper technique, and then an improper technique. Same thing on the other side. Improper technique. Proper technique. Now, to give you another angle demonstration of what I'm talking about, I'm going to go ahead and run right-handed for this one since the most viewers are going to be right-handed. If I'm using a proper technique on cover, and I'm coming out and the light is on the outside of the gun, I'm going to push it past the cover, and I don't backsplash myself. If you think about it, if I'm using an improper technique or I key the light too early, I'm trying to use FBI, and then the light comes out. Whatever the technique may be, on a right side exposure, I want the light on the right side of the gun, so as I lean out, I don't have to put as much of myself out to engage the threat as if I'm using the light somehow on the left side of the gun. Now from the other side, basically the same thing. In this situation, the Harry's grip wouldn't make sense because I have to lean out so far to get the gun in the fight. I want to stay behind the cover as much as I can and then push the light past the cover so I don't backsplash myself. In this situation, the FBI technique would make way more sense. Key the light as soon as I'm exposing from cover, push it past cover, and engage my threat, issue verbal commands, whatever I'm going to do. Whoa! Now, I kind of already talked about it, but one of the general reasons that max lumen on a handheld light comes up is backsplash. People say you should have a mid-range light, and we already talked about it. You want as much light as possible to gather as much data as possible, as quickly as possible. So if I can get a 1,000 lumen light in this size, that's what I want. If I can get a 1,500 lumen light in this size, that's what I want. I want maximum amount of lumens that will provide maximum amount of data quickly. The issue isn't the brightness of the light so much as it is the technique in which you use it. If you think about your own home, you know the floor plan. So there should be a very limited possibility for you to actually hit a solid white wall or mirror a TV screen or something like that and actually blind yourself because you know the floor plan. You should be able to avoid that to a greater degree than if you're entering a floor plan that you're not familiar with. But the way we search with a light is different than the way we confront a threat, which I think everybody's pretty familiar with or already seen. If I'm going to use a handheld light for a searching function, I'm going to use as much light as I need to gather the data that I need. If I'm using it for navigation, I may go lowest light possible just because I need to basically feel out my situation. I want to maintain my concealment based on the situation you're in. If you're in a law enforcement setting, you're searching for a suspect through backyards, 2 in the morning, you might navigate with low light but only search with high light. But if I'm just gathering data in an administrative feature or I'm searching for a known threat, I want to maximize my ability to use as much light as possible. Now the techniques I'm going to use to avoid backsplash are actually pretty simple, and we'll get into those right now. All right, so indoor use techniques. Residential, commercial, to a large degree, they're all going to have a reasonable ceiling height, which allows you to use the technique I'm going to talk about. If you're in a large commercial warehouse, it may not work as well, which is why there's alternate techniques, which I'll also talk about. But if you think about a residential setting, an indoor setting, ceiling height is going to be 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 feet, something like that. So in a completely dark environment, I have beam. I can direct my beam where I want to see, but if I want to see more of the room and eliminate the possible backsplash off of a wall, I can simply direct the light towards the ceiling. Now this works with a handheld much better than it does a weapon-mounted light, but if you think about a weapon-mounted light, and we'll talk about that in another video, but I want to keep my muzzle off of unknown, so I might muzzle up to a certain degree to illuminate more of the room. In this situation, the beam's directed at the ceiling, it diffuses the light, which allows me to see more of the room. It's not as bright, but I get to see those big details. If I'm looking for something small, like say I'm looking for a missing pin, obviously I need more light, but if I'm looking for something larger, say a person, this is a significant enough light to allow me to identify that general shape, and if I need to direct the beam, I can after that. An alternate technique in larger areas is to splash the light off the walls. It provides a reasonable amount of illumination, and it keeps the light out of your visual horizon, which keeps you from getting backsplash and losing your night blindness. But it's not going to work as well as umbrella lighting, as you can see. I'm still getting a decent amount of illumination with either technique, but umbrella lighting saturates or diffuses the light in the room evenly and allows me to see a little bit better than I would say baseboard lighting. Now, here, I'm in a commercial setting. This is a small warehouse. As you can see, umbrella lighting works even when the ceiling is, I'd say that's 18, 20 feet sloping. Baseboard lighting is going to provide me with enough light also, but which technique is going to be more beneficial to avoid backsplash? Because let's think about it. Backsplash is going to be where we're looking. So if I'm directing the beam at my visual horizon where I'm looking, as I close with a wall, I'm more likely to lose my night vision. I'm more likely to become blinded by my own light. So what I want to do is anytime I'm nearing an object where I feel it's going to have a semi-reflective to a reflective surface, I just want to direct my light smartly and use the light in a way that's going to still allow me to see where I want to go, but it's going to avoid creating a vision problem for me. So umbrella lighting, even in here, works really well. It's dim, but I can pick out those large features. Like again, if I'm looking for something really small, I need that directed beam. If I'm looking for a person, I can use this light to identify that general shape, and then if I think, okay, I think someone's in that corner, I can then direct the light to that position and start issuing verbal commands, or maybe like, oh, it's just a coat rack, let me go look somewhere else. So as you can see, even in this environment, umbrella lighting is still very, very functional. Now, how does this factor into, well, what techniques do we use outdoors versus indoors?
Now this is what's known as mesophic light or twilight. It's still bright enough that I can see a lot of really good fine detail as I look around, but it's dark enough that my eyes are starting to make the transition from photopic light, which is sunlight or daylight or natural light, to scotopic light, which is darkness, and that's when our eyes are at a larger disadvantage. So in this situation, basically your twilight after sunset, it's when you normally want to turn your headlights on. Your visibility is reduced to a certain degree, but as you can see, maximum projection, you can still use a handheld light in a defensive manner or gather data manner in those areas that don't get as much of a natural ambient light or light from street lights. Now take a look at what it looks like in total darkness in your normal ambient urban setting.
So night has come. I'm out here in urban Atlanta, inside the city, and as you can see, even standing here on this corner, I've got pretty much total darkness in this corner, but over here I've got a street light, I've got ambient light coming from the street. So I could be moving from environments that are pretty well lit to where I can see a lot of good visual data to areas where I need the flashlight. Now, if I was walking, if I was pedestrian and I was coming down this street or I was coming through this parking lot, I would want to gather data from right here, and it would be simple as just giving it a quick blast of light and just moving on. It's that simple. And that's one of the reasons that I want to have the flashlight at the ready, either in my hand if I'm able, or quickly accessible from the pocket or from the back pocket. I would dissuade anyone from keeping it in the pocket if there's a reason not to. If your hands are full, your hands are full. If you're with your kids or you're walking your dog or something like that, make every effort you can to have the light in your hand. So as you can see throughout this video, there's not a lot of mystery, mystique, or magic to low light handheld techniques, using the handheld light. I can explain the proper techniques to use a handheld light in a very short period of time, but it takes time to get someone to use those techniques correctly based on personal practice and your ability to actually go out and train and take a low light class. If you haven't had one, you should take one, at least one, preferably as many as you can possibly afford, so you can get those skills down. One thing I see in my low light classes, both the simunitions classes and the live fire, is it's very easy for me to explain that you need to push the light past cover, as an example. But the actual expectation meets reality. If a student's not familiar with the technique or familiar with the body positioning, or they find themselves in an uncomfortable situation, or they're under stress, they're not as likely to do it based on exactly how much they've practiced that technique. If they literally just got introduced to it, they're not as likely to do it consecutively. Now, students who train with me a lot, or guys who are seasoned and who've used light in real-world situations or have just practiced the techniques themselves, they excel, or at least meet the standards, so to speak, in situations like that. We're thinking animals. If I find myself in a room and I'm getting close to a wall and I feel like eventually that beam is going to backsplash in my face and not only illuminate me to a potential threat, but blind me, all I got to do is point the beam off. Either umbrella light, go to the baseboards, or just point the beam in a different direction and use the cornea of the light versus the hot spot to see what you want to see. Now, if I got to control somebody, hot spot goes to the face. That's the only way to effectively remove their visual horizon. I want to control them. I want to remove any kind of data they can get while I give myself maximum access to data. If I'm holding the light in their face, I can still see their waistband, still see their hands. I'm controlling them while gathering that information. People get wrapped around the axle a lot when it comes to low light techniques. And the argument, we've already talked about it, is there such thing as too many lumens? And the answer is no, there's not. Even if I had a 6,000 lumen light in a bathroom, I could still use it effectively and not blind myself just based on where I point the beam versus where I look. That light splashes, it's not a laser, so use it in that way, you're going to prevent the issue. You should have the brightest light you can possibly get, the brightest light you can possibly afford, the brightest light you can carry in your pocket and on your firearm. Now in this video we just went over handheld light techniques. The next video we do, we'll talk specifically about weapon-mounted light techniques. But I think I put some really good information out there. Obviously, if anybody's got anything else to say, drop it in the comments. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly. Whoa, whoa, whoa!
You want to hear a scary story?
So which light should I choose? A short answer, Surefire.